We have a lot of schools joining us today. My name is Julia Sherman. I'm the education coordinator here at Big Sky Film Institute, the mothership for the Big Sky Documentary Film Festival, which is why you guys are all joining us here today. Part of our youth programming is Filmmakers in the Schools program, where we bring filmmakers into schools from across Montana with Inspired Classroom as a partner. So they help us virtually get into your classroom. So you guys are all on a webcam and we can see some of you. We can't see all of you. So if you don't have a webcam, we have a live chat for you to ask questions and we will answer them as we move along. So just a little quick 411 before we dive into the film here. Just some kind of housekeeping things. If you're not speaking or asking a question, please turn your microphone off because the mics are a little sensitive and we get some kickback on this end. And be mindful of that for your other students. Please come up to the microphone and speak as clearly as you can. We want to hear your questions. We want to see you if you have a webcam, and we're excited to engage with you. So all that in mind, we do have classes from elementary school, middle school, and high school. So keep your language all ages. And this content is appropriate for all ages, so we just want this to be safe and fun for everybody. Just a quick note of the schools that are joining us today. We have Paul Condon's class from Hayes. Hey guys. Woo! We have Sierra Everett's class from Clinton. We have Patty Bartlett's class from Sealy. And who's with Spring Creek? Do we know the teacher there?
Ooh, Spring Creek is Mrs. Nykirk.
Mrs. Nykirk from Spring Creek. We'll have a few more popping in and out. If your class period ends before the end of this Q&A, just give us a little wave or message us in the live chat so we know that you're going. But we ask that you don't be too disruptive because we have a lot of classes popping in and out. But we're really excited. And we also have Ronan. So we'll have some more pop in, I'm sure, and leave as they go, but it'll be pretty flexible. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jeremy Lergio of the film River Queens.
Hey, everybody.
And Jeremy's actually a professor here at the University of Montana. And maybe a quick introduction before we watch the film, and maybe you could talk a little bit about how you moved to New Zealand for this film. Is that correct?
Yeah, I did. So my name's Jeremy Lergio. I'm originally from a small town in New Hampshire, and I came to graduate school in Montana, and then I focused on journalism and documentary photography, still image work, and worked for newspapers and magazines for about 10 years and started teaching at the University of Montana, where I got into film work because the journalism world got into film work, so I felt like I needed to learn by doing, and so I started working on short films. So I'm about 6 films into what I've done for my career in filmmaking. This project came about, I teach at the university photojournalism, video journalism, and I co-teach a class with Jason Begay from the Navajo Reservation called Native News Honors Project, and we team up writers and photographers to travel the state to cover stories important to the tribes of Montana. And so I proposed a sabbatical going to New Zealand to learn about indigenous issues in New Zealand. And so one of the stories that kept coming to the forefront was the Maori people going back to their original treaty in fighting for rights to the land that was theirs, or the rivers that were theirs. And so one tribe, the Wanganui Iwi, Iwi means tribe in Maori, their river they see as them, and they're the river and the river is them, and they see it as both metaphysical and spiritual. So I was really interested in issues surrounding the river and stories around the river. When we got to New Zealand, we moved the family, and then I started traveling up and down the river trying to get to know people, both tribal and non-tribal, who had a vested interest in the river. And one of those characters is the sort of lead character of the film, a 76-year-old outrigger canoe coach named Howard Highland. And I stopped with him, and he was actually just washing off his wakas from the day. Waka is the outrigger canoe in Maori, wakaama. And so he had just started a club for youth, high school kids, and he had moved back to his home river. And so I started talking to him about what the river meant to him. And then he started telling me about the story of these young women on the team and what their goals were for the year. And we started talking about the idea of maybe collaborating and doing a video story on it, and that's kind of how it evolved.
Cool.
So I was there working on a variety of projects and teaching at a university in Wellington, But I spent a lot of time up and down the river, both with the team and with another story that I wrote just about what does it mean when you legislate a river based on indigenous rights, saying it's a person to them, and how do you put that in law. So that's kind of I guess that's a long background for you all.
It's nice to have that the kind of background information before we see the film, so we have a little bit of context. So before we start, is there anything you want these students to keep in mind as they're watching, or do you want them to kind of go in without any kind of preconceived notion?
I would just say go in and see what themes maybe you see, and how it kind of unfolds. Maybe you have questions about film work, or maybe you have questions about working with subjects and building rapport with multiple subjects throughout a longer project. Yeah.
Cool. Great. We'll keep all those things in mind. We'll be playing the film now, so we'll step out of frame and we're going to bring it up here on the big screen. So enjoy the show, and we'll be back right after the film ends, and this film's about 15 minutes long, so we'll join for a Q&A discussion after the from the classes that are joining us, but I'll just start off with a question, and then we'll open it up for a little Q&A discussion with the schools.
Great.
So this film you moved to New Zealand to make, and you were there for about a year.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious how you first got connected with the subjects in the film, and kind of what that process was like getting to know them.
Yeah, so I read some news articles about the river before I ever went to New Zealand, and connected with a university there that taught journalism with the Maori people there, and trained a lot of Maori journalists. And I just started reading about the river and was really interested in the river first.
Mm-hmm.
So I read as much as I could about the history. When you go into any project, I didn't know I was going to do a story on a Waka-ama coach, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was interested in stories along the river. And then when I got there, I just, I have my dad's desire to go meet people. So I just started going out and walking up and down the streets of the towns along the river and meeting people. And like I said, I was interested in people's vision for the river moving forward, what they want to see the river do. It does have some pollution issues. And when I talked to Howard, he was a source in a story that I wrote about the river. And then when he told me about what he was doing with this club, I thought that sounds like it'd make a really nice short film. And so we just started talking and collaborating about, what would it look like? How, when would I spend time with them? Would the team be okay with that? Would the parents be okay with that? So that's kind of how it came about. It was probably moving to another country. It took about 3 or 4 weeks to get our feet on the ground, find a place to live and all that stuff, and figure out a little bit about the place. And it was probably about 3 months in that I met Howard.
Yeah.
And it coincided with, he had started the club in, let's say, it was around the summer of the year before I got there. So they were sort of at the tail end of their season when I met them. And so they went to the regional tournament the weekend I first met Howard, and I had some other work at the university, so I couldn't sneak away. And I said, if you guys do well at regionals, I'd love to come up and talk about working on a film together. So that's how it all started.
Yeah, really cool. Do we have any questions here from the schools that are joining us today on maybe on his process or the content of the film? Oh yeah, I see some hands up. What school is that?
Spring Creek.
Spring Creek.
All right.
We'll take some questions from you. Make sure to turn your microphone on.
How long did it take you to make the film?
Yeah, from start to finish, longer than I'd like, and I think most filmmakers will tell you that. You start in on a story, and as far as shooting it, it was really great because when they won at regionals, they planned a 3-week training camp, and they lived at the clubhouse for 3 weeks. And when they decided to do that, they invited me to spend time with them during that time. So I asked if I could spend a week to 10 days with them at the clubhouse. So that part was relatively short. 7 days sort of living and breathing, paddling with them. And then they had a few weeks off, and then they went to the national tournament, and that was in January of the next year. So we started the training December. January they did the competition, and then I did a follow-up in the spring, so around April. And then we moved back, and I started my job back here at the university, and that got a little bit in the way. And so I probably took a lot longer to edit this film. I brought in a gentleman who I'd worked with before to help me edit it. and some other people with sound and music. But from the end of shooting, it was probably another year to get it finished for me, mainly because I had other things going on. I think if we could have worked straight, we could have probably gotten it done in 6-8 weeks.
Yeah.
But life gets in the way and you have other responsibilities. So if there's one downfall, I would have liked to have turned it around quicker, just for the team, because they were so excited to see the film when it was done. So probably a year and a half total from first shoot to finished production.
Yeah, for 15 minutes, I think. And for those not super familiar with the editing process, an editor's job is to take all the footage that you capture on camera and then cut it down into a story that has kind of a beginning, middle, and end, whatever that may be, which is a huge job. But that's a great question, because I think sometimes we think that these 15 minutes doesn't take that much longer to collect all that footage and then whittle it down.
Yeah, the whittling down of footage is a long, arduous process, and what chapters do you keep? Part of me wanted to develop more of the story of each of the paddlers, because they had interesting stories themselves, but we kept with the narrative more about the team as a whole. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. I saw another hand, but we'll take one more question from that same school. I saw another student there that had a question. Go for it.
He's got his clipboard ready and
I love
everything.
Okay, people clean the river.
Can you say that one more time?
People cleaning the river.
Do the people clean the river?
Oh,
Clean the river, yeah. So that's kind of interesting backstory, right? So the indigenous people, the Maori people of the Wanganui River, they believe the river is them and it's an ancestor. And you heard Howard say the phrase in Maori that the river is them and they are the river. But it faces some threats to its health. There's at the high end where the river comes down through the mountains, there's a power company, and it generates power by taking the water and putting it into a giant lake and through a series of dams. And in New Zealand, they don't burn coal, they choose to use water and hydro. But that affects the river, right? It takes some of that headwater, which is clean and cold, and moves it into a giant lake and into another river. Then you get to the middle of the river, and it goes from being a mountain stream to a little bit wider river, and there's a lot of sheep farming and dairy farming, and they haven't, New Zealand hasn't always been good about how they've managed that. And so you have effluent from the farms and steep hillside grazing that brings sediment and phosphates and nitrogen into the river, which hurts fish populations, native fish populations. And then as you get down through the handful of towns, they've had problems with companies and sewage, and they've cleaned up some of that over the last 20, 30 years, but they still face some major sediment problems. As you saw in the lower river, it starts to turn a chocolate brown a lot of the year because of the sediment. But then there's also the simple question, as you asked, pollution, people not taking care of the river up and down. And so if someone throws something in the river, what's interesting is the girls in their team, they would take, you saw that scene, they would take and grab bottles from the river, put it in the boat as they were training, because a lot of it floats right through there before the river hits the sea. That was one of the things Howard really wanted to teach them through this club, was to respect the river and to care for the river. Good question.
That's a great question. And
let's go through the list of schools and give everybody an opportunity to ask. So,
Sure.
Does Hayes, do you guys have any questions?
Do they have any ups and downs?
You mean?
Like struggles? To their executive there?
Oh, yeah. I guess it sort of goes on to my question as well. Yeah, I'm in New Zealand, if you didn't know. I'm
I was
Maori.
going to say, it sounds like you're from New Zealand.
Yeah, I'm Ngāti Kahungunu. We're a bit to the east of those fellas.
Oh, yeah, cool.
Yeah, but I guess the question is, because these guys here, they have a certain kind of sports that they play here. And those girls, I'm pretty sure they don't just do wakaama. They're doing lots of other sports like netball, basketball, and rugby and all this stuff. Do you know what sort of other sports they were kind of playing? And the other question was ups and downs. What kind of ups and downs do they have in their preparation?
Absolutely, yeah. The first question is, yeah, a lot of the teammates were into rugby. Rugby's, a big national sport in New Zealand, so a lot of them played rugby. A lot of them played netball. And it's funny, it's similar to here where people balance playing maybe football and basketball or soccer and basketball. In this particular year, they all committed to the Wakaama was their main sport that year, which was a little bit of a struggle for them because they had friends on these other teams and they wanted to continue doing that. The one gal, Annika, is a really talented rugby player as well, and she's shifted a little bit away from Wakaama now. She still paddled this year in the championships, but she's shifted her attention to rugby as well. Ups and downs for the team, you saw some of them, and some of it is for a 3-week training, they were training really up at 5:30 to run, then a brunch snack, then out on the water paddling, then a full breakfast, then a rest hour, then they might have lunch, then they would go and do calisthenics and strength training. And when you're training that hard, it's easy to get grouchy. And so you could see them when you're in a boat together with 6 of you, if you're not in unison, the waka doesn't propel forward as much. You work against each other. And so that was one of the bigger challenges for them, was dealing with their exhaustion from the hard training to prep for this, but also learning to accept that tiredness. And that was one thing Howard really worked with them on. That one team meeting kind of happened earlier in the shoot, and all of a sudden I heard him sit down and I heard a seriousness in his voice, and he knew he had a team where people were starting to butt heads a little bit. And so he sat down, and I got quick on the cameras because I knew something important was gonna happen. And that was a pretty pivotal moment for them to realize they were working against each other and to come back together as a team. Those are some of the big challenges. You know, some of the, in terms of his team, there hadn't been a big youth club on the Wanganui River, and so there's different, they call them colleges, but the high school level, there were different teams doing it, and he wanted to bring in all of them under sort of one roof, the Wanganui Outrigger Canoe Club. And so some of that was building this team of paddlers who, it was in their culture and heritage, and they maybe did it a little bit with their relatives, but they had never competed. And so this was different for them to take something that was they knew and turn it into really it's a pretty competitive sport there. There were teams that much harder trained year after year after year, the same team. And so they were competing against some pretty good teams, and it was pretty amazing what they were able to do to make the final round and just miss by a few places going to Worlds, which was their ultimate goal. Yeah.
Yeah, great question. Cool connection, too.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Here in Montana.
Well, let's go on over to John's class then. Is there any questions over there?
What's with John? Maybe we'll move on to the next class down the list. Maybe Ronan?
So I think they're in Victor. I think that's Victor. And so Victor, would you go ahead and type in your questions, and then we will answer them live because we're having a hard time hearing you.
Okay.
So we do have a couple questions on the stream.
Yeah, so let's go ahead. So Celi's question is, what are some similarities and differences between paddling and rowing?
Oh, great question.
Yeah, so on the Wanganui River itself, there's sort of 3 different types of paddlers. You have the traditional sort of, when you think of like the Harvard Rowing Club and the English rowers, you know, and the sculls, and there's 6 of them, and you have oars. There's 2 or 3 clubs that do that. There's a kayaking club, and then there's Wakaama Club. In all of them, right, you're trying to propel a boat through your teamwork, whether you're 2 people paddling at the same time. So there's similarities in the sport itself, in terms of smooth is faster generally. In Wakaama, what's interesting is they do different lengths. And one length is a sprint straight down the river or lake or wherever you're competing. There's another one where it's 1,000 meters and they go back and forth. So the cornering becomes really essential. And that was something you saw in the training sessions, which is all 6 people have a slightly different role to pull that waka around and then accelerate out of that turn and not lose your momentum. So that's a little different and unique to outrigger canoe.
Yeah, great.
Good question.
Great.
Technical, I like it.
And then over at Clinton, we've actually got 2 questions. What is the significance to the shape of the boats is the first one.
Oh yeah, well it goes back to the tradition of Wakaama, and sort of a lot of Polynesian cultures had a you know, an outrigger canoe for transportation. So it started with that. Right now, the outrigger part, right, when you've got the two arms that come out, that is important because it keeps the boat from tipping. And you'll see them put two wakas together with the arms between them to hold it, or you'll see what you saw in their competition, the 6-person events. You have the waka itself, which is fairly narrow and tippy. If it's, you know, it's enough for you to sit in, but really it's right up against your hip. So it's not like a canoe that's a little bit wider. So it is pretty tippy, and you can actually, if they're going to corner and they get that the outrigger off, you can tip a boat even with the outrigger on it. But that's kind of the shape and for the purpose of that is stability and speed for the racing part. Yeah.
And then their second question is, what did you learn from your time spent with the team and coaches?
Yeah, probably first and foremost, approaching the story for me was kind of humbling. It's part of their culture. And so I learned a little bit of the language and the culture. I wanted to be collaborative in the process and make sure that they were happy with the way the film unfolded. So I learned a lot from them in those regards. A lot of it's patience, listening, letting them lead where the story went. And sort of being upfront that, hey, we're going to do this process and it's going to start here, and there's going to be a time in the 3 weeks that I spend with you that you're going to probably not want me to be around. And my goal is to be around to see the ups and downs. And so that one scene of the one paddler who was really upset that day because she was having some really bad shoulder problems, and she really felt like she was letting her team down. So I sort of learned how to, one, to get to know them as people. First and foremost, learn and respect their culture in ways. They do a karakia, which you saw in the beginning, where they might be blessing the food, or they might be setting up their intentions for the day and asking if that's okay to video. Those kind of things are helpful. So I learned a lot through them that way. But also a lot about teamwork. I mean, I think you see in the film through the coach what brings a team together. What are the things, and I liked his sentiment, highlight my strengths and my weaknesses go away. And I think that's a kind of applicable to whatever you might be into, whether it's music or making films or paddling or basketball, is to highlight the strengths and build towards those, which I think was a pretty nice theme for the movie. Yeah, good question.
From Ronan High School, what software is being used for editing, and what type of camera equipment did you use?
Yeah, so kind of on a technical question, if you're going to build a film right, you need to choose a camera format, an editing system. I kind of did this on my own. I looked for some assistance along the way for the national tournament, had troubles getting on a second assistant. So I did a lot of the shooting on my own. Actually, one of the girls shot some footage for me when I was running the drone. She helped me run the drone, so that was pretty cool. It looks like Lodgepole's leaving. Nice to meet you all. Thank you for being with us. Kia ora. Love it.
They might have another class coming in.
So camera gear wise, I had a Fuji camera system. I had a GoPro that you saw I could put on the boat, which was really good. Had a drone to be able to get in the air. The hardest part of this was being on the water. It's hard to be on the water and shoot because they move pretty fast, and I'm in a boat, an outrigger with other paddlers. They have to paddle equally as fast to keep me up. So that was the hard part. In terms of editing software, there's a lot of different platforms. I used Adobe Premiere because it's affordable for a single sort of solo filmmaker, and it was easy to share with my editor who was also using Adobe Premiere. You know, it's a pretty standard tool. There's also Avid and Final Cut. They do all the same things. I have some really bright students here at the university that will shoot on their phone and edit an iMovie, and they can put together a minute-and-a-half film in less than a day. So there's lots of different options there. I always tell my students the camera doesn't necessarily matter, but if I had a budget, I would have like a red camera with really nice lenses that gives you a much higher quality than the smaller Fuji camera. But I had to travel there with all my gear, so I went small film crew.
And then we've actually got a few questions from Victor. What did you learn in the process of making the film?
Yeah, what did I learn? I really like working in teams, not just from watching them, but it's hard to do a project on your own. It relies sort of on your own, setting your deadlines, but it's nice to have someone to bounce ideas off of and to collaborate with. So the coaches really became collaborators, the family became collaborators. I sort of bounced ideas off them, which is really, really unique and fun to do. But I think if I were to do it again, I would try to find someone who was interested in the story as well and had the time to do it with me.
Yeah, that's a big thing. I had a question regarding on like what you learned in the project with regards to water rights, because in the U.S., especially in the state of Montana and a lot within indigenous communities here in the U.S., water rights is a big issue, and it's been that way for a while now. But even with the Dakota Access Pipeline and those kind of taking that idea and localizing it a little bit. Can you explain a little bit? I mean, this is clearly a global issue, especially with regards to like native and indigenous populations.
Sure.
And so I'm wondering if you can kind of bring that to a Montana, more local context of what you learned there and coming back here after your experience.
Yeah, that was probably the hardest thing to learn, is to understand the history. There's some similarities in colonialism that happened across the world, in New Zealand and the United States, where native lands were taken, resources were taken for extractive resources, energy, and a lot of not great things happened across that. The thing that was interesting from what I learned from New Zealand is how innovative they are at approaching this. There's still issues, right? There's still issues between the Crown government and various Maori tribes. But they take really innovative approaches, and this one was saying, let's look at the river as a river first, and let's let the law build from that. And they built it from the indigenous perspective. And one of the lawyers I spoke to, the really important thing she said is yes, it might help the river, but it starts with the indigenous rights. So the whole law is written from their perspective. And then it comes down and say that we have to uphold these, and that means setting up teams to look after the river, setting up two voices to look after the river. And so that's kind of new in the whole nature's rights. It's sort of a more applicable, you can see solutions coming from it pretty quickly. And they also sidestep the idea of ownership, which in the US can be really problematic. Who owns the water right? Who owns the land? Who owns the resources? By putting the river first, all those things actually have to go through that. It's called the Te Awa Tupua Act. It all has to go through that. And what's different is they've also made the river its own being. So the Wanganui River is essentially they call it the Te Awa Tupua, which means the river, metaphysical, the spiritual, and then from the source to sea and all the water tributaries. So they're looking at it as its own being, and then the law goes from there. So there are some groups in the U.S. that have sought similar protections. In Lake Erie, the Klamath tribe has gotten the same for their river in their territory. But it doesn't spread outside their borders to the greater Klamath. So there's sort of these who owns what and whose jurisdiction is it, and that can be problematic. And that's something we're going to have to face really across the world. Rivers in lots of countries have problems with sediment and problems with farming and problems with dams taking a lot of the clearest, coldest water. Probably the most interesting thing I learned was that hydro is clean in many ways, but when you steal that cold, clean water at the top of a river, it affects the ecosystem all the way down. Yeah. Does that kind of answer your question?
No, definitely.
Yeah, there's a lot. I read a lot of reports on the river I did a written story with photographs about that, about water quality and what does it mean. Excuse me, what does it mean when you give a river personhood? Can it help? And I think New Zealanders really feel like it can. So I think one of the chief negotiators and one of the elders for the tribe that I interviewed for that story, the things that they sort of said is this is not going to happen overnight. It's not like we give it personhood and we just clean the river up and it's perfect. It's going to be a 10-year process, and then they really feel like they're going to have a great story to share with the rest of the world about what they've done. But it's also happening. There's a mountain that has personhood. They're looking at that as a way to sidestep ownership and take care of the natural landscape and places that are sacred to them.
Starts with education.
It does, right? Yeah, and that's their whole motto with the Te Awa Tupua Act is it starts the first really 2 years were education. We need to bring people together. We need to visit all of the communities along the river, both Maori and non-Maori, and get people on board with the concept that the river is its own entity and everybody's connected to it. Yeah, it's pretty powerful stuff. So I was inspired by New Zealand. I was telling them that what they've been able to achieve is pretty cool.
What kind of costs were involved in this project?
Budgeting.
The budgeting. So I was fortunate enough, I got a university grant to go there to teach at another university. They paid me a little bit to do the teaching, so I had some help moving there. And then I had a little bit of cost for in-country travel. So which probably amounted, once we flew the whole family over, I had really not much left. But I basically budgeted a $5,000 budget for traveling around the country to do these various stories. And I pretty much used most of that with gas.
I drove. Not a very large budget
it's
in
not,
the scheme of things.
Yeah, if I had it all over again, I could have gotten someone to commit to give me a little bit more money. I would have been able to hire a second camera person, and that would have been really helpful. And then when you get back, you got to do all the editing. So that I did was a labor of love. My friend, I traded him hours. So I helped edit another film in the festival called Paradise. And so we traded hours. So he would give me 10 hours of editing and I would give him 10 hours of editing. So that was a good way to do it. And then I got another little bit of money to pay for color and sound, which is also expensive. When you have a film, you finish it. If you want it to look good on screen, on any screen, you need someone who's really an expert in getting the tones perfect, the brightness and contrast, and the color. So I outsourced that to a person I've used before. And then a music place called Cloud9 were willing to work with me on a pretty shoestring budget, which was great.
Oh, that's great.
And so they helped. You know, they do really great composing, and then they mastered the audio. So that budget was, you know, probably should have been around 10 grand for all that, and I got it for a lot less.
Nice.
Yeah.
Costs of polishing.
Right. Yeah. It's not cheap to make a film and get it finished. That's what I've learned over doing these.
Yeah.
But when you do it, it looks a lot better on every screen you see it on. Yeah, good question.
As I'm sure you guys noticed.
Yeah, I hope you all noticed. I hope it looked good on your end.
And then a question from Celie is this type of paddling in the U.S. or other countries, or is it just unique to New Zealand?
No, so it's definitely, you'll find it in terms of the U.S., the big outrigger canoe, there's competitions in culture is in Hawaii. Similar outrigger canoe is there as well. There was a film, oh, I can't think of the name of it now. Forrest Woodward, who's a good filmmaker, did one on outrigger canoeing in Hawaii, I think last year. So yeah, you find it in most Polynesian cultures. Canoes were a very big part of their culture.
And then from Victor, what other films have you made, and or what future projects do you have planned?
Yeah, you guys are really, this is really fun to hear from you all from different places.
Over here.
So I made my first film. I needed to find something that was easy and I could just do in my spare time while I was teaching. So my first film was about a guy and his dog who climb mountains and ski together. And so it was a short 5-minute film. I hooked GoPros to the dog and ski poles and trees, and it was more an exercise in like, how do you ski and get good footage from a dog's perspective. It was called Backcountry Baker, and that went to a few festivals, and it was it was just a nice light story. And then after that, I did a story on an 89-year-old ultra runner named Bob Hayes, who at the time, 4 years ago, was 89 and still pursuing 50Ks, 30Ks, running about 30 races a year. And he did everything the hard way. So he split wood by hand. He used a crosscut saw. He heated his house with wood. And that was a 20-minute film, so it was sort of my biggest project at the time. And I co-directed it with a colleague of mine, Eric Peterson. And that was really fun to work on. We spent a year with him from, all the way from a summer through a summer. So we saw the winter when he was writing his hand. He picked up calligraphy in his elder years, and he would handwrite in calligraphy his Christmas cards. So we followed his story on all the things he did with purpose. And then Eric, I edited some films with him, one on an ultra runner who does 100-milers and hunts for big game in Alaska, and how those two sports interacted with him. And then we did one on ski joring, which is the crazy skiers that go behind the horses around the West. And so he shot that, and I helped him edit it. Actually, while I was in New Zealand, he hired me to help him edit that one. And then Eric and I just worked on one called Paradise, which is about a gentleman who's a Trump supporter with a big gray beard and had a mine in his backyard that didn't come good when they had to clean up the area behind his backyard. And then there was a bigger mine proposed behind him, and he stands up to fight against it. So he joins a local group of business owners, and we track what this group does to fight for the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So those are kind of the handful of projects. Future project, actually, I don't have anything on the docket future-wise. I'm sort of in a nice pattern of just gonna see what happens through the year, but I'm getting itchy seeing all these great films at Big Sky.
Yeah.
You get inspired when you go to these festivals and see all these great stories that help. I hope that films inspire people for doing better in their own lives, whether it's sport, whether it's taking care of a river, whether it's taking care of your backyard. So I'm hoping that something will come to me that inspires me in the next 4 or 5 months.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like a lot of the films that you've made and pursued are very active films.
Yes.
They're not like ski joring and all these things where you know,
Yeah.
having a steady cam is pivotal.
Yeah, I do seem to
Never a dull
go
moment,
down
I'm
that
sure.
angle. I think it's because I like being out and doing stuff, and I like
Yeah.
seeing what people do.
Mhm.
Yeah, good question.
In the action.
Has the film won any awards? And how old were you when you started filmmaking?
Yeah, so the big award was getting into Big Sky. You know, being honored by being here with all these great films is a huge success for the film. It was a semifinal. So there's a paddling film festival, so it was a semifinalist there, which was pretty cool. And then, you know, I hope the big thing is a lot of the New Zealand festivals I entered just now. So there's one called Dock Edge, which is really good. There's an outdoor adventure mountain festival in New Zealand, and those are all coming due now. So I won't find out about the New Zealand festivals for probably another 3 or 4 months, which is a little frustrating because I want the team to see it. They've seen it. I showed it to the coach and the team and the assistant coach, and they loved it. But their first thing was, when can we share it? And I said, you got to hold off. We got a few festivals we're trying to get into, and we're trying to get it broadcast in New Zealand as well. So those are kind of the ideas for that. And what was the second part of that question?
How old were you when you
Oh,
started?
how old? Well, I got into it in probably 2011. So I would have been 37. Yeah, so 10 years ago, maybe 37 years old, I got into film. I had done a lot of photography from high school. I was into high school photography, and then I took some documentary studies program about long form stories in still photography. I did a master's degree in still photojournalism, but I got into mixing audio and photos to make stories. So 15 years ago, the audio slideshow was really powerful, and so I got into doing those, and that sort of segued into video. So that was really when I hit it full bore and started learning the trade.
Yeah.
I still feel like I'm, you know, you guys will know this, I still feel like I'm learning a ton every project. Got a lot to learn still.
Yeah, and you can dive into new careers at any age. I think that's awesome.
You can, yeah.
kind of pursue a path and get to know it.
Yep.
That's cool.
For
We
sure.
had some students in yesterday that were in high school sharing a film that they made. So it's cool to kind of show the scope of, you know, people with different experience levels, kind of diving in on
Yeah.
the front end and the back end and what projects you have under your belt. And so I think it's encouraging for students to hear that on on the whole spectrum of
For
things.
sure.
Really cool.
Sure.
I know that there was a question from Lodgepole. We can take a few more questions here and then we've got to wrap up, unfortunately. So we'll take Lodgepole and then maybe 2 more questions.
Hey, how's it going? I got a question. I've just got a new class in here, and kind of interested what activities and if you got to play some rugby when you were in New Zealand, and what other activities you did when you were there.
We're being corny.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think the really great thing about going to another country is sort of going with an open slate. So our family went with we're gonna be open to everything, and so we did. My son joined a rugby team. And so we got to play on the weekends with some of the coaches and players, and so I learned a little bit about rugby. I'm not really the build. I'm kind of fast, but man, I don't have the build to be hit too hard. So it was all touch for me, which was great. I got to do a little of the Wakama paddling with the coach, which was fun to learn that as well. And then the school that my kids were at did a lot with Maori language. So they were learning some of Maori language. I took a university night class so that I could learn some of the language, and it helped me really understand, you know, very little bit of the history, but also to be able to understand some of the terms and customs was really cool. So those are probably things we did. We spent the most time doing. My son did play on a soccer team. They had soccer there, which was good. That's his thing that he really likes to do. But yeah, the rugby was fun to learn. We got to go to an All Blacks game, which is was just, I mean, we were so glad. The last game was about a month before we left, and we got tickets, and it was pretty remarkable.
Is that for rugby?
For rugby, yeah, that's the New Zealand. So for students, that's the New Zealand national rugby team, and they're really one of the best in the world, if not the best of the world historically. And they're great. If you haven't looked at, they do a haka before the game, and that's sort of one of the highlights for me was seeing that in play. It's this really loud chant, and they're all in unison, and it's powerful, echoing through the stadium. So that was pretty cool. Yeah, exactly.
From Victor, what inspired you to start filmmaking?
It was kind of a natural progression from still photography. I like to learn about the world and understand the world and then share what I learned through pictures. And film was another way to build stories where you can hit a play button and in 3 to 5 minutes you can learn about someone's life, their inspiration, their challenges, and you can learn something from it. So I think that's why I got into film. It's sort of a different medium. What I like about still images is when you do a still story, you're looking for a handful of really important moments in people's lives and stories, and you're trying to put them in a single frame, and you can run around with the camera, and you can crouch, and you can jump on ladders, and you move all over quickly. And with film, you have to be a little bit more methodical about, we need these shots to build us through the story, to develop the scene. A lot of times you saw in the film, we would hook Howard up to a mic or the girls up to a mic so we could hear them talking to each other and hear what their coaches meetings were about, and hear him as he's coaching the girls and saying, you got to reach out and power. And so film, you have to be a little bit more forward thinking about what you might need out of a shoot. Whereas stills, you can kind of blend in and follow the story. Yeah. So that's kind of what I've been learning about video, is how to build those scenes and find those good moments and be there at the right time. The other thing is, when you hit record, for those of you who are interested in film, is knowing when to let the camera just roll and let the moment happen and not be worrying about the next shot. Yeah, good question. You guys, great questions.
Yeah, let's take one more and then we'll wrap things up.
All right. What problems did you run into while making the film?
Every project has its problems. First and foremost, the one was like, I didn't want to get in the way of their training, and I sort of approached it as a journalist would, and I didn't want to say, hey, can you do that sprint again? And so trying to follow them along the riverbanks in a car or walking or biking or in a boat was kind of problematic to get good on the river footage. I think if I did it again, I would probably have Howard take me out in the boat one more time, and he would just take a power boat and keep me along the girls the whole time so I could do more just beautiful shots of them training on the river. The competition was the hardest because they run all the competition airs online and on broadcast with Maori television, and so they have a crew that's doing that. And so they were going to give me some footage, and it turned out they just didn't have great stuff of my girls, so I wished I had had a second shooter to say, get on the boat, or they wouldn't let me put a GoPro on their boat, which is just part of the rules for the competition. They have one GoPro that they let the broadcast use, and that was it. So I didn't have, you notice in the film, a lot of the footage of the race is from far away. So that was probably the biggest challenge. In retrospect, I probably should have talked to the drone pilots and said, for one race, can you just follow my team, and offered to pay them a licensing fee to that footage. And I should have been a little bit more forward thinking on that one. So that was a challenge. Getting to know the team, you know, some of the team was right away totally on board, and some were like, we're willing, but a little bit hesitant. So sitting down with them and just getting to know them really is the most important thing in filmmaking, and let their story lead their story, not your idea of what you think the story is. And that can be hard when you're thinking, I need this shot, and I need that shot, but then stepping back and letting them lead where the story should go.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question.
I was talking to a filmmaker with a short film about a French resistor, a 90-year-old woman, and they had made a portrait film about her, and they were saying, you know, this was collaborative. We worked with her to tell her story. You know, we didn't come in there and say, this is the story we want. It was very fluid, and I think that's one thing with documentary film, you know, there's so much that can be unpredictable that is actually maybe can make a more interesting story.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think you've touched on that really well.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. We have really had the pleasure of inviting you in and having this wonderful discussion, so thank you. A quick note to our teachers, if you guys can make sure to get numbers of students that are attending with us, and, you know, of course, names of schools, it really helps us keep this program going and continue to get in classes across the state of Montana. If you students want to take a moment to write down a few things that you learned from this film, we would love to hear from you. Any additional questions that you still have, feel free to pass them along to your teacher, and your teacher can pass them along to us, and we can kind of keep in the communication loop, because we do want to hear from you, and we know that there's more questions out there. Unfortunately, we do have limited time. But thanks again, and last but not least, we have one more film, part of our Filmmakers in the Schools screening with Inspired Classroom this afternoon at 1 p.m. So if you or any interested teachers are interested in participating, we'll be screening a film about Bigfoot, and we'll have the filmmaker and another special guest with us this afternoon. So if you have the time and you're able to join us, we'd love to see you again. And Jeremy, thank you so much for taking the time and answering these great questions. You guys are so impressive.
Thank you all. Thanks for joining the conversation and keeping me thinking about film and story. And yeah, great questions.
Yeah, and then inspiring the next filmmakers in the next
Yeah,
generation.
you know, and don't feel free to reach out, you know, as through my university role as well and the festival, you know, we try to get out to high schools as well. So feel free to reach out to us if your students are interested in journalism or filmmaking.
Yeah.
We can connect you with the right people here too.
Thank you. These are great contacts. And thank you guys so much. And we will hopefully see you at 1 p.m. this afternoon, and have a great rest of your day.